Welcome to St. Sarah's Parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church in Boston. This is part of our lecture series. This is the first of two lectures that we're going to have on the Levitikon. This is Levitikon, the Gospels according to the primitive church. I'm giving this lecture because I'm the person who translated it from French into English. I first wanted to start off with a few comments on the name itself, Levitikon, because oftentimes people ask, well, what does that mean? Well, it's something of an enigma, although it makes perfect sense. There are several sections to this book. The portion that has been published and completed are the Gospels, which are basically, it's the Gospel of John with some minor differences. It has 19, it's organized first of all into Gospels instead of chapters and verses. There are no verses, there are no numbers. When I translated it, I purposefully left it exactly the way that it was translated by the Frenchman in the early 19th century who translated it from the Greek. So I did everything in my power to make sure that the textual integrity was there. So what you're seeing in English is basically what you'd see if you could read the French, right down to some strange sentence constructs and different things that make it, I think it's actually easier to read in most ways than a regular gospel or a canonical gospel, just simply because you're reading it the way that it was actually written instead of being chopped up into verses and chapters. But the name itself comes from Levi, or in English Levi, which is a Jewish, a Hebrew word for a priest. But it's also a tribe of Israel. John, the apostle, was also called Levi. So it has a conundrum in its own name. The Levitikon is the title of a series of works. One of those things is the Gospel, or the Gospels, and this is the 19 Gospels. And there are other sections of the book, including the actual Levitikon itself, which is a priestly document. So Levi also means priest. So it has a double meaning. That the part of the text which deals with the priestly hierarchy and so forth is not coming from that era, not coming from 2nd century or 1st century AD. But later. And then there are commentaries. There's a commentary on the Apocalypse of St. John. And there's a statute, a fundamental statute of the governance of the church, the Johannite church, as it existed in 1812. But these are things which were added. What we're talking about in common parlance today are the Gospels, the Gospel section of the Levitikon. So when I say Levitikon, that's what I'm going to be talking about. So what are some of the differences between Levitikon and the Gospel of John? Well, first of all, as I said, there are 19, it's organized differently into 19 Gospels instead of 21 chapters. But there are all kinds of things, there are things that happen because of that. There are things that are missing, there are things that are different, there's a different sense in some places. So although it's not as radical as some people might have thought in the past, there were some people who were very, very romantic about what they thought the Levitikon was. And I'm happy to say that the translation proves to me that the tradition itself was very much an internal Platonist tradition following from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century divisions within the Christian communities in Asia Minor, leading all the way down to including the Bogomils and the Cathars. So these are people whom we know treasured the Gospel of John. In fact, in the case of the Cathars, they used a copy of the Gospel of John. They held it over the initiate's head when they were coming into the fold. So the Gospel of John in the Gnostic world has always had great significance, and the Levitikon pretty much vindicates that. It vindicates that the two words, Johannite and Gnostic, are almost synonymous. Gnostic, of course, is much broader. But Johannite is definitely an early apparition, you could say, of one of the Gnostic communities. And it's something that we see come through from Asia Minor and Levant, moving over into Western Europe later. But when it comes to this document, it's very mysterious, and it crops up at a time in French history which is very, very chaotic. From basically, as you know, from 1789 or so, right after our revolution, all the way up until the 1830s. France was going back and forth from one form of government to another. There was a revolution, and then the consulate, Napoleon took over. This is happening at a time of great flux in French society. Now, at the very end of the 19th century, much after this was translated into French, the Gnostic Restoration, which was held with, or you could say in cooperation with, certain portions of the Johannite Church, where all the Gnostics came together in 1890. There's a very interesting quote that I wanted to give you from a non-Johannite point of view, from none other than Valentinus II, the controversial Jules Douanel, who was the patriarch of the Gnostic Church in 1890. He's the man who was responsible for the French Gnostic Restoration of 1890. And he wrote, John revealed to us that from the start, in the beginning, the Logos was emanated by God, and from the Logos emanated truth and life. The same John, in Revelations, prophetically shows us the New Jerusalem that comes down from the heart of God, adorned like a wife for her spouse. This is the very holy Gnosis. It is again he who sees the symbolic woman coming from the sky, clothed in the sun, crowned by 12 stars, and having the moon under her feet. That was again Jules Douanel. He wrote that in August of 1890. So you can see that John, even for a non-Johannite Gnostic, is key to Gnosis, to the whole concept and the historical understanding of the value of Gnosis. So, why is it that John is somehow affiliated with Gnosticism, or why is it that some of the community of John from the 1st and 2nd century grows and changes into, some are what would be proto-Orthodox people, others would be what we would now call Johannite Gnostics. Why is that? Well, first, beyond the different the changes that you see between the differences between the two, the Levitikon and the Gospel. Beyond that, there's no virgin birth. There's no crucifixion. It would likely have been the only book that was used by that community. So the community of John came together to probably write this over a period of time, possibly not entirely under the direction, or maybe under the direction, but not under the direct hand of the apostle, just like all the other Gospels and books of the Bible. So it's something which is growing with the community. And you see that coming in the 2nd century. The 3rd century, it matures. By the 4th century, there is a clear difference between the Gnostics and the Proto-Orthodox people. So those are some of the differences. But I think probably the most important theme of the Levitikon is exactly the same as the regular gospel, in the sense that it begins with this very, very, what we call high Christology. What does that mean? It means that instead of trying to create or to explain the human person, the development of the universe and our spirituality and how all these realities come together in terms of a myth, a legend, a story, it gives you instead a framework of concepts and ideas or ideals. The first thing that it talks about, in the beginning was the Word. What's the word in Greek? Logos. And he doesn't mean a word, he means an ideal. So it's a very Platonist expression of spiritual thinking. So you could say, your first, and there is no difference between the Levitikon as it was recorded by the Johannite, or possibly, anyway, if we take it as real, and the regular gospel. The basic principle is the same. The importance of John is obvious, and the Platonist implications are not only interesting, but they can help us. They can save us from the endless bickering over jots and tittles, you know, crossing T's and I's and being litigious about who said what, and can you do this and can you do that. It doesn't even go there. It doesn't talk about commandments or anything. The only commandment that you'll see, I mean, there are some suggestions and there's some commentary by Jesus. No question about that, right? In the Levitikon and in the Gospel. You should be careful about how you do your spiritual workings. I am the way, the truth, and the life, you know, so there's one door, there's one opening here which is a responsible way to do things. There's a certain way that you have to do, that you have to abide by. You can't expect to achieve gnosis, you can't expect union with God on your own terms. But it doesn't say that you can't do this and that and the other thing. It says, you know, this is the basic idea. This is the framework for our discussion. This is how you can move forward. This is the beginning. So in the beginning, you have this ideal. And everything has a corresponding ideal. So the Logos shows to us that although things seem unjust and messed up in the material world, it doesn't mean that the material world is necessarily evil. It just means that you're not seeing the full picture. So if you open yourself up and follow that path, and you look at the light, which is the life, he says. The life was the light, and the light was the life. So where the light is coming from is the place that you need to go. It doesn't have any other prescriptions other than to love others. That's the one commandment in the Gospel of John, and it appears in the Levitikon. This I command you, that you love one another as I have loved you. So, very broad. Now, why, I want to go back a little bit, because why is the Levitikon important? In other words, why was it that we translate that, you know, I wasted all that time, or didn't waste all that time? You know, was I just doing it for fun? No. It's only been in French. It was actually found in, well, wait a minute. I don't want you to take my word for it. as you know, I'm kind of a skeptic. And so I always like to frame things in what our enemies have to say, because it helps me to understand where they're coming from and maybe some of the weaknesses of our position, right? So in the latter part of the 18th century, so the 1700s, and the early part of the 19th century, as I said, France was a real mess. Things were going on. And there was a woman, and she has one of the longest names you'll ever hear. Her name was Charlotte Victoire de Foulet de Tessé, Marquise de Créqui, de Aimont, de Canal d'Ambrière. She was a grand lady. She was a marquise, and so she would have been involved with the court of Louis XVI. And later, she survived very well, and she and her son, and she had a lot of influence, and she was a big talker. So we're not sure if it was actually her or if it was her son, but she had a memoir. And in the memoir, she talks about everything. Who, whose dresses were the best, and who looked like an idiot, and who drank too much, and who was out whoring that night, and whatever. I mean, it was all there. So if you want to know what happened between 1780 and 1812, Madame de Créqui is your woman. And she knew about Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat, and she knew about the Johannites. And she didn't like them because she was an old guard Roman Catholic. So she was very traditionalist, very, very, very much against all these, freedoms that she saw as dangerous. But she noted. And why she gave so much history, I don't know. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Bourg-Molay, who was tortured to death in 1314 and whose family survives to this day in the Nineveh, had created, during his captivity in the Bastille, 4 mother lodges: for the east, Naples; for the west, Edinburgh; for the north, Stockholm; and Paris for the middle. The day following the execution of the Templars in Paris, Sir Nicholas of Aumont and 7 other Templars, disguised as stonemasons, came to collect the ashes of their brothers. 15 days later, Sir Erskine de Fleuriot, who had denounced the order, was murdered in the Place d'Avignon. Pope Clement V had done him a magnificent funeral and declared him a venerable servant of God. But it appears that certain of the Templars removed his body and deposited it in the tomb of Jacques de Molay. Then the 4 lodges founded by him began to organize themselves, and all the Templars took an oath to destroy the power of the Pope, to exterminate the Capetian dynasty and all monarchs, to excite the peoples to revolt, and to establish a universal republic. In spite of her negative views on esotericism and Johannite theology, Madame de Créqui corroborated the story of the discovery of the Levitikon in a paragraph that comes right after that little story of the Templars. She wrote that the 8th century manuscript was discovered at a bookstall in the Quai de Gèvres by a certain doctor, Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat, who is, if you don't know, founder of the modern Johannite Church. She goes on to explain that Fabre Palaprat purchased the gilt volume for 25 francs, which was a good deal of money, by the way, back then, and showed it to a certain Monsieur Dacier, who dated the vellum incunable to the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V, who reigned from 741 to 775. So that gives you some idea of when it comes, where it comes from. Although an opponent of the Johannites, the Marquise also mentioned that Dr. Fabre Palaprat at last found a conscientious translator who left everything blank that was no longer legible. So it's possible, however unlikely, that there are portions of the original gospel which might have been there, but he didn't copy them because it was illegible. Now, she wasn't very, she says that that these Gnostic and Manichaean ideas were, basically hymns in honor of the devil, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, some of it's ridiculous, but it's okay. It's not unusual. Those kind of charges still, float around, right? Nevertheless, it's important to remember that she's a very important contemporary and independent voice and source, which confirms that as a result of the reemergence of the Templar order, which is what Fabre Palapprat was doing before he was involved with the church, or one came and then the other came, let's put it that way, that the Levitikon is literally the spark that ignites this new church, or continued church, let's put it that way. The reemergence of a church which had been basically secret. And what a better time than post-revolution France, because even under Napoleon, Napoleon was very liberal when it came to religion, so no problem there. And we'll see that there's a relationship between Fabre Palapprat and later liberal monarchists. He was a liberal monarchist, not a traditional monarchist, which in France there's a big difference. So he was not in favor of the monarchy of Charles X, who was the Bourbon. He was actually a proponent of Louis Philippe, who was, I know this sounds like splitting hairs, but instead of calling himself the Roi de France, which means the King of France, he called himself le Roi des Français, which means the King of the French, which was a very big distinction in those days, because it heralded back to, or harkened back to Napoleon, to the liberal, constitutional, and democratic empire. I know that sounds strange, but it's a very big difference. It's a very big difference, because the King of France is the person that she's talking about. She's saying that our tradition is basically was sworn to their demise, to the Capetian dynasty's demise, because of what they did to the Templars. This is the old mythology. And there was a lot of that kind of symbolism going on. So in the year, in 1804, when the Levitikon, when Fabre Palapprat found this vellum manuscript, he was living in a place that was full of these kinds of revived symbols. For example, Napoleon in 1804, here in the United States, Thomas Jefferson was president. You might remember that because he bought Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, because Napoleon needed money. So that gives you a time frame. 1804 was the height of Napoleon's power. He was getting ready to invade England. That's how powerful he was. And he started what they call the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor. And he had this grand sort of outdoor party for his army and for these legionnaires. Fabre Palapprat would receive the Legion of Honor, which is still France's highest civilian and military honor. But he would receive it later. He would receive it in 1814 when Paris was besieged by France's enemies. He was a doctor in addition to some other things. I'll go into him in a minute. So why was it important for him to find, or why was it important to Fabre Palapprat? Obviously, he knew that there was something about this document which was absolutely earth-shattering. First, you have to remember that he was born in 1773, Fabre Palapprat was, in the southwestern part of France, in Colby, which is near the Pyrenees. And the nearest, just to give you some idea, the nearest big city is Albi, which was the seat of the Cathars. Sometimes the Cathars are called Albigenses or Albigensians. So he was no doubt, from a very young age, aware of the history of the Cathars, and he no doubt became interested in it later. But as a person, he actually was a practicing Roman Catholic. In fact, not only was he a practicing Roman Catholic, but he went to seminary, and he was ordained a priest. So later, it's unclear why exactly he became disillusioned with being a priest. And so he went to medical school. And he received his degree in 1798. He moved there and got another medical degree in 1803 and became Director General of a philanthropic hospital, basically. But he also served in the court of Napoleon as a foot doctor for the emperor. So it was probably some extra money in his pocket. And also some social, people used to get these kind of jobs. Monarchs used to give out little jobs like that. Sweeper of the royal kitchen, in order to have some prestige and have some excuse to come to the court, have experience, exposure to other people. It was a prestige thing. And Fabre Palabrad was all about prestige. He was very flamboyant, and the other parts of Levitikon that have to do with more mundane things reflect that his tastes were rather luxurious and colorful. So, 1804, the year that they found, and in that list, you would find a list quite familiar, because many of the people, or actually all of the people who are named in that list, are named in our long version of the Litany of the Sovereign Pontiffs. So it goes from John, from the Apostle John, all the way down to, at that time, the last person on the list was none other than Bernard Raymond Fabre Palabrad. So, this is some background on the history of the document itself. And I'm going to open it up for some controlled questions. I want to keep them brief so that we can actually record them, because I think it's important. I've given you a flavor for the first part of the Gospels. I knew that this was going to be way too much material to cover the content of the Gospels and then the whole history of the book itself. So I've told you basically where it came from, what the idea was around it, why it was important. What was done with it, obviously, was the foundation of this church, and others, actually. So it's a very important document. It's an inspiration for people, and whether it's actually verbatim from the 2nd or 3rd century, who knows? We'll never be able to know that. As I said, I think the most important part of the actual Gospels is not very much different, but we can talk about the differences the next time. And I'd be happy to answer any questions this time.
What became of the original vellum Greek document?
The original document was held with a number of other really interesting relics that the Johannite Church owned. They had their...
Does it still exist?
If it does, it's in a private collection, and I am not privy to that information.
That would be potentially interesting.
Yeah, some of the illegible material might be readable now by some of the technology.
Yeah. I'd be happy to look to see if I can find it, because I'm pretty good at that.
For the importance of such a document, this seems to be an important question, important issue.
Not particularly. Not particularly, because do you know how many original pieces of the other Gospels that we have in all of Christendom? You could fit them in a shoebox. So to have a whole manuscript is unusual. I'm sure that it's if it wasn't destroyed by fire or something like that, because the original stronghold, you could say that they had a kind of a treasury, which was really just a safe in the back of an old, they called it the Apostolic Court of the Temple, which was in what's called the Court of Miracle, which means the Court of Miracles, which was the slum in Paris, which, if you've ever been to Paris, is not far from Les Alpes, which is where all the fishmongers and stuff are. And that area was destroyed. There was a big fire, and then the rest of it was destroyed under in the late 19th century when they did the avenues during the Haussmann thing. So, but I'll look into it to see what chance this is true. Good chance it's been lost.
I'm much more curious about, I mean, the history is great. I trust you that, all these things are true. I'm more curious about what it actually says and how it differs from.
Well, you can go ahead and ask. I mean,
Well, I think it's amazing. Like the thing that really hit me, I took, I looked at, compared it to the other Bible, and well, the big thing is John. I mean, he says John will be your father until he comes.
Mm-hmm.
Until he comes to be me in paradise. In other words, until he dies. I think that's what it means.
Yeah.
And he will anoint you in the Holy Spirit, and that's the traditional Peterite church, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. That's the other big distinction that that I failed to mention, which is, I think, because I think we kind of take it for granted that we, as Johannites, we have always held that John was the first pope, and that his successors, as ours is.
Yeah, but Jesus, according to this Levitikon, Jesus names him the Pope, as opposed to the Orthodox Catholic Church. Peter sort of assumes the role of Pope. I don't think they have it say that Jesus said that. You will be my stone. Or
yeah, they do use that passage.
The stone passage. Yeah.
Yeah, upon this rock I will build my
Upon
church.
this rock.
Yeah. So, and it's according to our institutional narrative, which comes through Masonic sources. I don't know if it's originally from a Masonic source, but the claim is that the history of there being different lineages that are doing different work comes from that period. So that the work that Peter was doing was different from the work that John was doing. And so that's certainly historically true. The work that Thomas was doing in India was completely different than what everybody else was doing. So the institutional narrative kind of implies that was how it was intended from the beginning.
By Jesus.
By Jesus, that John would go off and do the esoteric stuff, and Peter would go off and do the exoteric stuff, and this guy would go off and do something else, and this guy would go off and do something else. I mean, I'm generalizing, but...
All right, that could be the case.
So the 12 apostles are, symbols of 12 schools,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
you could say.
And then Paul came along and kind of messed the whole thing up.
Yeah,
how
which, that's the real. And the funny thing is, though, that Paul is, if you reduce the pastoral epistles, the letters that he writes, which are not really from him, they're much later and heavily redacted. If you boil it down to what we think is old enough to actually be Paul, He's fairly Gnostic.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh yeah, read Pagel's The Gnostic Paul.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
pretty
Wayne
astounding.
Pagel's.
Yeah.
What survived of what he wrote into the?
It's
Yeah,
there.
sure.
You can. I mean, if the thing is that he probably of all the apostles uses the word gnosis more than any of them.
But not in the traditional Bible, not in the.
Absolutely, yeah.
They just translate it and call it knowledge.
They
But
call
go
it
ahead,
knowledge.
Go ahead and read it. You'll see
They
it.
call it knowledge.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
You refer to 12 apostles too, but let's not forget Mary Magdalene, the one that he spoke to the most. So there was
Yeah.
really 13 different schools. So she definitely had much.
Yeah,
more.
and there's a difference in Levitikon. There's a different treatment of Mary Magdalene. She's the only person who, let's see here. She is definitely elevated. Let's put it that way. And in some cases, I think the regular Gospel of John kind of tries to minimize her, and there's a lot of confusion as to who she is.
Well, maybe you could talk about Raymond Brown's scholarship and his theories on the community of John. That might help.
Yeah, I kind of touched on the basics of that. Father Raymond Brown has passed away a number of years ago. He was a Roman Catholic scholar and a priest, and he was a great scholar. He was probably the most respected student and teacher of Johannine history and theology of anyone ever in any denomination. And he wrote a book which is required reading in our seminary, actually, which is called The Community of the Beloved Disciple. I highly recommend, if you can handle a really heavy theological treatise. It's serious stuff from a serious man. And God love him, he was really honest about what he found. And what he found was that over a period of about 300 or 400 years, say from the crucifixion in their case to 4th century, the community of John is very big, and
Very big, did you say?
very big, and it has its own way of doing things. So there's no doubt in my mind that, and I'm sure that Father Brown, may he rest in peace, would agree that the book that we call the Gospel of John was their document. It was their living document. And there you can see, in the document, you can see, how would I say, disputes going on between various factions within the community of John. I'm not talking about the rest of the Catholic Church, the ancient church. I'm talking about just the community of John. So that would have been small communities dispersed in Asia Minor, principally. He was the bishop, or the at least we would call him a bishop of Ephesus. And then later, there's some dispute about whether it's John the theologian is different from John the apostle. I'm not even going to go there. I mean, you start out in the Gospel of John, and who does it start talking about? John was a man, and who was he? He was John the Baptist. It doesn't even talk about John the apostle. So St. John the apostle was a follower of St. John the Baptist before he followed Jesus. So, yeah. So, there are, and this is something I think that's very important, and I hope this is still filming. When I first started, I was interested in joining the priesthood as a Jesuit when I was a young man. And I actually went so far as to meet with Father Donald Monin, who used to be the president of Boston College. So I was that serious. And I had problems with Catholicism. Not really Catholicism itself, but a lot of the things that I saw missing from such a very complicated and detailed religion that couldn't give me answers in places that I really needed them. And the reason wasn't, the fault wasn't on the Roman Catholic Church. It was my fault because I was looking in the wrong place. But when I was interested in joining the priesthood, I started to read a lot. And I went overseas and studied. And I started in France. It happens to be in France that I started this. I was, exposed to a lot of these ideas which were not very popular here yet. And I came to understand that there was this tradition. And so I started to pick up books and stuff and follow different esoteric authors and, all these conspiracy theories. And it was great because I was interested in history anyway. And I remember that, I don't know, I guess this was much later, I was following that trail and I came upon the word Johannite in a very naughty book. It was, yeah.
Mr. Picky?
It was the Templar Revelation.
Ah, yes.
And this is parlor, parlor tricks scholarship. But it's fun, and it's interesting. And some of it's true. A lot of this, it's more like journalistic type writing. Lynn Fignet?
Yeah. So
Yeah, anyway, the Holy Grail and Holy Grail, all those things. And there are French equivalents that I started to read, Rosicrucian stuff mostly that I was reading in France. And so I came across this word, Johannite. I was like, oh, Johannites. And I finally found something interesting, right? But what they thought of Johannites, or what they were pushing as what Johannites were, is only one kind of Johannite. That is, they were saying that this big conspiracy, just like Dan Brown picked up and went off on the whole conspiracy theory of John the Baptist maybe being the one who was chosen, and Jesus perhaps was this, dark magician, whatever. There are lots of theories, right? So, and then, but they did their homework, because they found, that I also found the word Levitikon. And in this mysterious Levitikon, you were supposed to find that it says that Jesus was an initiate of Osiris, or which it doesn't not say. It kind of hints towards that. It kind of hints towards the Greco-Egyptian cult. Okay, fair enough. But it doesn't come out and say anything about Osiris. Now, just to put that to bed. But it's very possible, because as I said, sort of, I'm not going to call it Egyptian because it wasn't really Egyptian, but there was a certain Serapis, the cult of Serapis, which was very popular during the Roman period. And actually, there are places that are very important to John the Baptist that are coterminous with temples or temples to Serapis. So there is a connection there. But that's where I saw those words. And from that day, I vowed that I would find this Levitikon, because I just had to see it, because they just made all these ridiculous claims. And it turns out that the claims that they were making were heavily influenced by the existence of a real people, which we know as the Mandaeans. The Mandaeans, whom we respect and have brotherly or sisterly affection for, as Johannites, pre-Christian Johannites. So they're a kind of Judeo-Samaritan, Galilean followers of John the Baptist without having gone into the Christian fold. So, is that wrong? No, absolutely not, but it's a different group of Johannites. They are truly named after John the Baptist. We are named after both. So, I think that, when you look at these things historically, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that none of that was important to my spiritual journey. I mean, it was important only insofar as it brought me to a place where I could discover the real work that has to be done internally, and the real places that you have to go internally. And all this other stuff is just frosting. I mean, really. Anything, all of it. I mean, some of it is important, some of it is, I feel, inspired and directly connected to the Spirit and should be respected as such. But does it make the difference? Is it the thing which is the all motivator? No. There's only one thing, and this is why I think that the name or the title or the designation of Gnostic is still relevant at all, is its ultimate meaning, which is people who understand the ideal, not the belief, the ideal of Gnosis. And that we have within us the capability of directly connecting ourselves to the mind of God. So as fun as it all is, and as interesting and informative as these things might be, I think that the beginning of the Gospel of John is one of the most beautiful things that you can ever read. And the longer you read it, the more times you read it, the more you can understand the very complex and almost light images of another way of thinking that's not about me or you. It's when you start to realize that you're connected to something that's much bigger than you are. And that's life-changing. So, it's interesting that today, of all days, the baptism of the Lord, which brings in all these things, John the Baptist, I mean, Cherry is really honored, I think, to have her baptism day as the baptism of the Lord. It's not easy to forget. And I think it's really significant, because if there's one message other than Gnosis that you get out of this, out of the Levitikon or out of any other Gnostic gospel, it's that what you have within you is also divine. There is a piece that's inside of you that's connecting, and that's what opens up the door. So what we're doing here is just opening the door wider so that you can get through. And that's the thing that we're working on. So these ancient traditions and sacraments that we do, it's not hocus pocus, it's real. I mean, I can't tell you how much energy is involved in confecting the Eucharist, the host, that, I mean, my hands shake. I was kind of skeptical about it, I'll be honest with you, before I started doing it. And when His Eminence was here, I told him, I said, hey, I can't even believe the difference. So it's, the sacraments, so starting with number one, baptism, that's a tremendous, I mean, the prayer. Did you hear that prayer before when I got down on my knees? That's one of the most beautiful things in the liturgy. It's just incredible. You're giving, you're not blindly giving yourself up to some entity. You are communing with it. And from that, then you learn what where you should be going. So the people who are detractors of the Johannite tradition, or people who are critical of one form of Gnosticism or another, or one form of Christianity or another, you can just blow a lot of wind and you're not getting it. You're not getting it. So any other questions? dumbfounded.
No, we're waiting for the room to know.
I guess I don't have questions, I'm just impressed. Like, in the first passage, they talk about, the word, but they said, in darkness, I was comparing it to the other Bible. In darkness, in Levitikon, darkness did not understand of the word.
Yeah.
As opposed to abokamek,
Yeah.
It makes-
The darkness did not
It makes
understand
more
at all.
sense,
When I first started translating this, I looked at the first 2 paragraphs and I was like, oh God, where did I get myself in? Because the way that it is described in French is exactly like that. And I was like, wow, that's,
That's not the one you
is that a
read.
thing? And it isn't. It's just, that's how it reads. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It
Because
makes
it's, very...
the whole
What do you,
thing.
what do you think of that? You've taken a look at this, Father,
Oh, I've spent quite a bit of time with it.
Yeah.
Overall, I found the Levitikon to be a bit of a contradiction. A lot of what it leaves out, and there isn't a lot that isn't in the Levitikon that isn't, aside from the last 2 chapters. But I mean, we'll put those aside for a moment. For the first 19 chapters, the stuff that's missing is largely the little commentary bits that appear in John, in the Gospel, in the canonical Gospel. So when Jesus says a prayer, there's a little parenthetical in the canonical Gospels where it'll say, Jesus knew he didn't have to say this out loud because God hears him all the time anyway, but he did it for the people. Like that kind of thing is missing from the Levitikon specifically.
It's just a comment. Really.
So it points, I think, in my mind, to one of 2 things. Either somebody with a deft hand went in with a little scalpel and cut those things out and was aware of what was happening within the text itself, or it represents a pre-didacted version of the gospel. And I won't make a claim as to which it is,
No, we don't know.
but
We have no idea.
it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah.
And other little bits that are missing seem to me, and maybe this is being from the French, it seems to me that it emphasizes the humanity of Jesus a little bit more than but not to say that the
It
high
does.
Christology isn't there.
Yeah, but I thought that, because that's what the parlor tricks people were to say.
Well, right.
And actually, so
No, but
there's
the miracles-
miracles, and
yeah,
the
right.
miracles are there.
Right,
Yeah,
that was
they're
what
roughly the same.
the temple. The Masonic sources all said was that the Levitikon was a document where the resurrection narrative was gone and all of the miracles were gone, and that's not true. I mean, the resurrection narrative is gone. Obviously, the last 2 chapters are gone,
Yeah.
but the miracles are still there. The water into wine at the wedding is still there.
Sure.
But he touches the water.
Yes, that is
And-
very. That's right.
In the other case, he didn't. So
Right.
it's not quite
So-
as powerful. Still powerful.
And the
But
big
there are
dimension-
things that are almost identical in
Yeah.
that story, like, this is the most important thing in the entire thing, is the first time that the Virgin Mary says anything, what does she say?
They don't have any wine at the wedding.
There's no more wine.
Oh my God! What are we gonna do?
But I noticed,
The Mother of God would like some more wine.
but I noticed in the Levitikon, I mean, in the traditional Bible, the other Bible, Jesus calls her a woman. He's almost disrespectful to his mother. But in Levitikon, it's not that way.
That may be translation issues.
Okay, okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be.
That's what I suspected
Okay.
when I read it.
All right.
Yeah,
But without the original Greek, it's really hard to tell.
it's all Greek to me.
Well, I actually looked at Greek, so I looked at the Greek.
Wait,
If there was
that
a-
Greek version of this thing exists?
No. But I can compare to the canonical version.
Oh.
So I can say, maybe, this is what they're trying to say. Because oftentimes the French is very different. It's difficult. I mean, there are cultural differences, so it's hard sometimes to get an exact translation.
So if the original of this thing's not available, did anybody make a copy of the...
Confessors, they're priests.
A Templar?
Yeah, it's a modern day Templar order.
Oh.
And...
Of which there are many.
Of which there are many, yes. And he gave it to His Eminence, who then gave it to me and said, hey, can you do this? well, it
Take your
wasn't
time.
that,
I'd like
it wasn't
it
that
maybe in a couple of
unceremonious, but the Apostolic Council said yes, and he approached me when I was in France, and he said, could you, start working on this? So it took 2 years for me to, it wasn't continuous work, obviously I was working. But it took a long time, because especially because it was a gospel. You can't, you can't fudge.
Another question I'm using about, there are these very old codices from ages and ages and ages ago, and some of them, I haven't gone back to look or double check, but presumably some of them have variants of the Gospel of John. Has anybody ever gone back and checked them against the Levitikon?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, I'm sure that has happened for canonical sources, so it would probably be an easy transposition.
Because, for example, the things that you're noticing are different. It would be fun to find out whether the same things are different with old original, quote-unquote original text. Some of them date from, I don't know, 130 AD or thereabouts.
Right.
Yeah, small pieces though.
Right. But all you need is a couple of places where you've got overlaps, so things are different to
Yeah.
shed light.
When I was doing this, you can look at simultaneous translations of, I think I was looking at about 15 different versions.
Oh,
So
wow.
you already did
I
this.
could see what, what other people were saying about it. I only did that if I had a question. See,
Well,
because my job was to translate it.
Right,
I wasn't providing any, kind of academic background, just to translate the work, which, as you can see, it was actually published publicly in 1831, I believe. It was written down and printed for internal use, probably around 1814, between 1814 and 1820.
So is that similar to the one that was published in 1831, or were there more changes made in between? You can't have a gospel get published without going and muddling with it, right?
Yeah.
in the 7th chapter, he says, the Spirit comes when he's glorified. Now, if there's no resurrection, what is glorified? That's the question I have.
Well, first, I don't think that if you look at the narratives in the first, particularly right before Nicodemus, Jesus says, or there is a narrative that says that Jesus didn't need to know, he didn't need to be told what to think of people. He just he could tell, he had this power
The
to
gnosis,
be able to,
right.
the gnosis, that he was connected to an intelligence which told him everything he needed to know about people.
Yeah.
So I think that in that case, his powers are definitely played out before they say that. So his powers as a person, as a
healer is amazing.
right. Yeah, it's clear throughout,
Yeah.
and there is no reduction in this, as had been previously theorized, of his powers. The interesting thing is that in the French they just keep calling it science. They call it
Science is
science.
Science?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, his science.
Yep.
They call it his science, that he knew the sciences. It's a word that crops up more than once. And in English it's
It'll be miracles or something.
miracles,
Yeah.
or something very, it sounds very supernatural. And this is very
Yeah.
sciencey.
Exactly. Well, and I think that kind of ties into the part where, when he's talking to the crowd, and forgive me, I get all the sections confused in my head, but he's talking to the crowd, and they say, well, why should we listen to you? Weren't you trained by the Egyptians? And this is the part where...
In the Leviticon?
In Leviticon.
I remember reading that.
It's in there somewhere. in the canonical version, it says something like, "Why should we listen to you? Aren't you Joseph's son?" But in the
Yeah.
Levitikon, it says, "Weren't you trained by the Egyptians?" And I think this
Yes,
is where that,
yes, no,
Okay.
yes.
yeah,
What knowledge is this, from the Greeks or the Egyptians?
yeah, that's the one.
Aren't you Mary and Joseph's son,
Yeah.
or whatever?
Yeah. So I think that's, if you're pointing to a person who is an initiate, if Jesus was an initiate in the Egyptian mysteries or the Greek mysteries or whatever it happened to have been, then the word science is actually kind of fits. And that's how I read it. And so when you're talking about a spiritual technology, if somebody's performing works that are available to other people, that aren't just because he's the Son of God and he is
It could-
divine.
But it
That's
doesn't.
one reading.
It doesn't say that. I
No,
mean,
it doesn't say
It
that.
doesn't say that. It says that he has all these things plus, I think. That's what I got from it. I
Yeah,
mean, because
okay.
there's just like some undeniable things, like that portion that says, an example that I just mentioned to you. It's in the second gospel, actually, at the end of the wedding, Passover, and he says, "And some of them understood his teachings, believed in his name, but Jesus, for his part, was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men. He knew everything about them, and he possessed all the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
He did not need anyone to testify concerning man, because he himself knew everything there is to know about the outside and the inside
Yeah.
of man."
Mm-hmm.
So it's clearly,
Right. That's why I
it's-
said originally that it seems a bit divided.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
There's a one, on the one hand, you're reading things that make him sound like a person who is really good at stuff, and on the other hand, he's the Son of God,
Really
the
good
pre-existing
stuff.
Christos. That
Yeah.
yeah.
So that there is, I think that it works, but I'm sure that Fabre Palaprat would agree with me that it just so happens that it fits in perfectly with Johannite theology, because there is no resurrection, there's no crucifixion and resurrection,
Mhm.
so it doesn't matter whether you believe in a literal, death and resurrection or not. And the Logos actually possessing this person is clear. It has to at least be that.
Right.
It has to.
And you
but
can
it
take that
points
as
to
far as
you
close-
want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can take that as far or not very far.
But what does it mean by to be glorified if he's not resurrected? Okay, the Logos possessed this person, Jesus, let's say, for instance.
Because he's reached all the levels of, he's reached all the levels of gnosis. He has plugged himself into God. He is a living.
Wasn't he already that when he said it?
But his
No.
will, you could say, his being is completely filled with the Logos. So he's
I realize
aware of everything, like the Logos.
But that was the case when he said, "When I will be glorified." But he already, if he was at state A when he said, "When I will be glorified," then
Well, what? Yeah. Okay.
you understand?
So,
I mean,
how many artists are glorified when they're living?
do you mean the whole church becoming this huge thing?
Isn't it a thing?
I can't deny that.
I call that glorification.
All right. Makes sense.
The day we have a church event,
Well, then I'll stop talking.
that's
All right.
pretty much glory in my book.
All right. Okay.
I mean, again,
that's more
you don't
glory.
have to. It doesn't require you to. Again, going back to
That makes sense.
the framework of the ideal, it doesn't require you to really worry too much about details like that. How you perceive those things, hopefully will change over time. They should change over time, because if you're learning, your perceptions are going to change. So it just so happens that this framework works, and it works. It's been working, and it continues to work at a very small, and I like to think, quality level.
Of course you would. What do you mean that there's no crucifixion in the Levitikon?
Yes, those chapters aren't in it. Well, I'm sorry,
But it
the
doesn't-
crucifixion
No,
is.
the crucifixion
sorry,
is,
the
but
crucifixion is.
the
resurrection.
resurrection narrative isn't there,
Okay.
which is kind of important, because especially back when the Docetists and all these people were saying that Jesus was just a man, or that Jesus was entirely divine. And a lot of, what is it, anyway, there are a lot of different Gnostic type myths that went along with this, including Pandera, which was, or Panthera, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which says basically that it was that Jesus was so powerful that it was kind of like a trick, that he wasn't really dying there, and that he took John up
He
on
took
the
John up
mountain
to the mountain.
and looked, and they were
They were laughing about it.
laughing about it.
What's this, some other book?
Yeah, this is not in the Levitikon.
I don't know.
I'm giving you an idea of all the different ideas.
The spectrum.
The spectrum of
Conspiracy
speculation. No!
No, these are
No.
ancient documents. Yeah.
Ancient,
Yeah, certainly there were schools of thought that said that. Well, for example, even in Islam, even today, there's a tradition that it wasn't Jesus who was actually crucified; that it was somebody else, or
That's the Pandera.
yeah, exactly. So that there was somebody crucified there, but Jesus, he's too good for that, so he's off somewhere else, and or that the spirit of the Christos came down upon Jesus at his baptism and then left before the crucifixion, and it was just a man, and that was where the "My God, why have you forsaken me?" line comes from.
Oh,
So this is
interesting.
all of this whole interesting spectrum of the nature of Jesus. I mean, it's the whole early part of the church. Is the entirety of it is arguing about who was this guy.
Yeah. So the only, and I think that it's
Why?
really, and this is why the more you learn, the more you realize that this whole idea of us versus the Roman
Right.
Catholic Church is just absolutely false. Because the church itself, I mean, the ideals that you see in Orthodox Christianity nowadays come from, basically, Constantine said, you guys need to get your together. Because you don't agree on anything. And if you're going to make, we're going to make this
We're
the
gonna find one thing.
religion. Now, what they don't say, though, in that commentary is that the state religion of Rome had been changing, and in educated circles had become very Platonist by the time of Jesus, even by the time of Jesus. So that while the gods, the Homeric gods were still sort of the low culture, just like we have things like that even today, where people, go to saints and all this kind of thing, fine, that's fine. Now, I'm not saying that it's low in terms of bad, but it's a folk kind of culture, as opposed to this kind of philosophical kind of theology. So between Mithras or Sol Invictus, which is the same thing, basically, or other, Apollo the sun, there are all kinds of cults that were leading towards this Platonist monism. It's not monotheism, but it's very close. And so that movement, I think it's fair to say that Constantine understood that very well. He was clever. He wasn't even baptized until he died. But he realized that it was infectious, that Christianity was not only important, but it was becoming...
Would you say that it went viral?
Yes, thank you, Father.
Went viral.
It definitely went viral. And it made all kinds of sense to people who were already in that monist, Platonist area. And it was a lot easier, and it made sense, and it was pure, and they were looking for redemption, they were looking for a new way of doing things, and this new religion could be melded or molded with Mithraism, and which is why, by the way, we have this sign. I mean, this sign is the key row. The key row is much older than Christianity, but it's a sign that the Roman Catholic Church uses, and the Eastern Orthodox use it. And originally, it meant something that was good. It was used as by editors in Greek to say, this paragraph is good. So they would put the key row. And so something that, it actually comes from, it's an abbreviation for Christos. But Christos, as you know from our liturgy, means anointed one, someone who's been chosen or anointed. So a very special person. In the Johannite tradition, it says very clearly in the narrative that Christos, that word Christos is actually used for leadership of the community, not just for Jesus the Christ. So it kind of puts more of an emphasis on the individual as a potential Christos, as a potential Christ, or the impulse of Christ, in internal impulse, or both internal and external.
Yeah, and then Philip who says don't strive to become a Christian, but become a Christ.
Become a Christ.
Yeah.
That's right. That's Philip. Yeah.
Philip.
Gospel of Philip.
So,
So that's that basically gives you the background of what Christianity was doing. So why did all these change? Why were all these changes made? Why does Orthodoxy emerge like that? Because Constantine said, if you don't get your together, we're going to kill you, and you're not going to be in charge. So what did the bishops do? Okay, we have to agree on something.
Yeah. Who's in, who's out?
And they were having a devil of a time, and the Gnostics were giving them problems. But there were the Gnostics were the least of their worries.
Yeah, the Gnostics were already sorted by the time that came around.
Yeah.
You know.
Well,
And, I mean, they weren't really concerned about it at that point. It doesn't come up in the
Arianism.
Arianism was the big one. Yeah.
Arianism? I'll listen to that.
Yeah. Read the Wikipedia article on the ecumenical councils. It's very interesting if you're interested in that kind of thing.